Okay, so that kind of gives you a backdrop as to my parents, part of that Windrush generation that left Jamaica and went to England. And as I mentioned, they were young, they were ambitious, they already had certain life experiences and work skills that would allow them to make the transition from Jamaica to what they defined as the mother country. This was before Jamaica became independent, right? That generation was raised under a colonial British system. So everything that took place in Jamaican society was intrinsically linked to England. The education system, the legal system, the economic system, the political system, everything was shaped and defined to a large degree by what they defined as the mother country. So I know in terms of even just growing up with the Windrush generation, that they definitely believed in the mother country, had a certain reverence and respect for England, and to a fault to some degree. Their customs, their habits, everything was really shaped by the British way of life, even though they were hundreds of miles away in the warm climates of the Caribbean. And you probably understand that if you grew up with Caribbean parents, that you could say no wrong about England to them, growing up. I know we hear the term Windrush generation, and I want to really give you a perspective of who that really means, especially because my own parents are part of that generation. I've given you a sense of my parents as young people in Jamaica. So let's fast forward now to England, all right? My mum said that when that generation came, well, she came and my dad, they came by plane. So they flew from Jamaica to England, that the fares were subsidised by the British government. The British government paid for part of that fare to encourage more people to come. They had to have documentation to come in, right? They showed they were British subjects. And when they came into the airport, and I think she said that she came in through Gatwick Airport, that from there they took a train to, is it Paddington Station? I believe it was Paddington Station, showed documentation again, and then they were not allowed to leave that station until someone came and picked them up. So I'm saying that because there's been a lot of current discussion around documentation required and having to show that you were legally let into the country. And keep in mind that back then, that if you're inviting British subjects into the country, they don't just come in, they're not illegal. There was a whole system set up that monitored and controlled that movement. It wasn't that you just come to the country and you land and that's it. Okay, there was something very systematic going on at that time. Just keep that in mind, okay? Anyway, so let me go back to my mum's and dad's experience as part of the Windrush generation. So my dad came to England in the early 1960s. When he came, he stayed with a family member who by that time had already purchased a house. And that was a common thing, right? Most of that generation, the Windrush generation, when they came, one of their key challenges was in terms of housing. So what they quickly learned was that if you can purchase a house, and then what they would do is rent it out to the newly coming people, right, from the Caribbean, and that will be their base to start them off. So here's my dad. He was renting a room. When my mum came and joined him, they stayed in this room. We had a few families in a home. Everyone had their own separate rooms. There was one kitchen, which was, a communal kitchen. There was one bathroom. But my mum says that most times that they didn't necessarily use that all the time. And part of it was because she didn't like the fact that there were so many people bathing in one, bath. Both her and my dad used to actually go out to bathhouses. But she says back in the 60s, there were a lot of bathhouses around London where you could actually go and pretty much pay for a bath. So you'd go, you'd pay them X amount of money, and they'll give you like soap and a towel, and you'd get to bathe in a separate bath for a certain period of time. And she said that her and my dad used to do that a couple of times out of the week, which I found, when she told me that, I thought it was extremely odd. I said, so you used to leave from work and then go somewhere and take a bath and put on your clothes, go back through, back out into, the street and then home? She said, yeah, that was a common thing. And yes, my mum did confirm that there was a real challenge when it came to renting homes, renting rooms, especially in terms of the English people. They faced some real discrimination. So I asked my mum, did you really see signs that said no dogs, no Irish, no blacks? She said yes, that was a common thing, that people would write that and post it on their windows, or post it on their doors, so that when you were looking around, or you'd go to the newspaper, or you'd hear from a co-worker that such and such a place on such and such a road is renting a room or a flat, you'd go there, and to deter the Windrush generation, in this case specifically people of colour, from renting, they would have these signs up. So before you even came and knocked on the door, you would see that sign and you'd know, no, we don't want you, don't even bother knock here. Housing was a real challenge. But the good thing about my Jamaican parents is that back in the Caribbean, and I guess for all, the Caribbean countries, is that they were used to living in homes. They were used to building their own homes. They were used to the idea of ownership of home and of land. So they brought that same mindset with them to England. In addition to that, they had an economic system. Now in Jamaica, we call it the partner system. And what that really was, in a nutshell, was coming together with a small group of people and pooling your money together, so that by week, the people within the partner system, let's say there are 5 of them, would throw a hand, and person number 1 would collect. So if the partner was $1,000 or £1,000, that person number 1 would collect that money and it would be theirs. And then the group would pay into the partner until every single person has collected a hand. Anyway, there was that economic base that they had, and that is what they used, many of them used, to allow them to get down payments towards purchasing their own homes. In fact, my mum says that she used to throw a hand into the partner system on a regular basis and then put it in the bank. And then she heard from one of her African co-workers that there was a project going around where to become a homeowner, but you had to have X amount of pounds as a down payment. Her and my aunt went to the bank, they pulled out the money and they went to wherever it was they had to go and put the money down on the house. And she didn't even tell my dad, right? And after she did that, and my dad was upset with her because, you know, that was their main source of savings. But when he realized, okay, you know, what the bigger goal was to become homeowners, you know, I guess it was okay. The point I'm making here is that my, and maybe your, Windrush Generation parents or family members came to the United Kingdom with, you know, these ingrained habits, right, that kind of allowed them to survive and to struggle and to make their way within British society. Another challenge that my parents faced, and my mum discussed that with me, was in terms of the social life, because when they came, they was, well, first of all, because they were coming to a predominantly white society and a predominantly white working class society, they had very little in common with that group. Because if you know the Caribbean, especially back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, poor white working class were not the ones predominantly going to the Caribbean. Not then. It was mainly middle class and upper class white people going to the Caribbean. So my parents, my grandparents would interact with that level of person, and in their mindset, that is who the British people were. So my mum says that when she came to England, that they were very surprised to see that there were poor white people, right? So on a social level, there was a difficulty in terms of integrating with these people, because the working class white people, for them, there was a definite racial barrier that did not allow them to see my parents as being equal to them as working class people. So you find then that the Windrush generation, as young people, came together with other Caribbean people and formed a union. And there was a commonality anyway. I mean, in the Caribbean, there's always going to be and always was a commonality among the islands. You know, similar music, foods, ways of expressing themselves. So from that, on a social level, it was there was a very strong and tight-knit sense of unity as the Windrush, especially in terms of culture, of Caribbean culture. And they would come together and have house parties. And for my generation, that really is where the blues dance was born. It was from us growing up and seeing our parents have their house parties and intermingling with the music, the food, and just the general, socializing among each other. So the Windrush generation would start off with their house parties, and over time they started to invite their English neighbours, and those who came and then got exposed to a different way of living amongst our Windrush generation parents. Another challenge that my parents faced was in regards to race relations. They are a Caribbean group, a Caribbean population going to a primarily white country, and most of the Windrush generation ended up within white ghettos. As you can imagine, you have different cultures clashing, different cultures coming together. There's always that kind of clash first until you start to really get to know each other as human beings. There was a general hostility against the Windrush generation, and that, my mum says, started to increase when the Caribbean people started now to purchase homes through the pardon system, right? And then there was that kind of suspicion that they must be doing things illegal, because how did they come into the country, X amount of years ago, and they're already purchasing the homes, and then neighborhoods started to change. But like I said, the Caribbean people at that time came in with an economic system and a value system that allowed them to progress, and strive for these things. So race relations started to become more and more hostile, because you're seeing this upward mobility among the Caribbean people that may not have been understood by the British whites at that time. And in addition to that, remember, it wasn't just Caribbean people coming into the country. There was also Africans coming into the country. There were people from Asia coming in. So you'd find that they would end up in the same kind of ghettoized communities and have to struggle from there. And then you might find that the Asian person might be the person that opens up the business next, or the African person. And there was increased hostility, because now they were not only just owning homes, but now they were opening up businesses. So, and in addition to that, there was the start of many interracial relationships. Now, as I mentioned, that the first wave of Windrush people, or the Windrush generation that came in, were primarily young Caribbean males. Some of them were married, some of them were not. Naturally, they would look at the women around them and start to form relationships, because you got to look at that as a natural thing that you do as a young person. And you'd find that there was a certain amount of interracial relationships that were taking place, and that created an increased amount of hostility against Caribbean people, and mainly in terms of black Caribbean males dating white English girls or women, right? And then in addition to that, my parents, like other members of the Windrush generation, also faced political hostility. And you might be familiar with the likes of Enoch Powell. So people who on a political level would hype up, the hostility among the groups for their own political gains, would create more division on a political level. So these are some of the things that my parents did face, and were exposed to as part of the Windrush generation. I can't say that my mum said that she faced any level of negative abuse, but there was always that level of intolerance, or of judgment, or not being given the due respect that they could and should have had, but they continued to live their lives. But as time has gone on, the Windrush generation integrated into British society, and one of the reasons why I asked the question, do you care about the Windrush generation, is not just because of the current political climate in England at this time, but because I think a lot of that history, a lot of their history has not been documented enough, not being discussed enough, and I think this is something that I've always been emphasizing within my channels. If you've been following me, then you know that within many of my videos I've always mentioned about the Windrush generation, especially because I believe that they are one of the key factors that help to push England into becoming a multi-cultural society. So in hindsight, I just wanted to kind of give my own perspective on the Windrush generation, especially in light of the current political climate when it comes to immigration in modern day England. And I'm not even sure why the Windrush generation seems to have been caught up in what I am defining as almost like collateral damage because of the very stringent immigration policies that England is putting into place at this present time. But the question I'm asking is, do you care about the Windrush generation? You know, and like I said, before you even begin to answer that, click on to some of the links that I have left below. Get a greater perspective of that generation of people, because my comments are not objective. Obviously, these were my parents. This was my parents' generation, and they were the ones that came to England, and I think set the framework that created a very multicultural society. It wasn't without its struggles, it wasn't without its challenges, but I think that it definitely is a framework and an experience that needs to be acknowledged greater than what I'm seeing. I thank you for sharing your time with me. I hope that my hindsight has and will inspire you, and that you will find your own way to blossom.